Section 1. The $4 problem. Somewhere in your tackle box, buried under the soft plastics and the $80 jerkbaits, there is a piece of bent wire with a metal blade on it. You probably paid about $4 for it. And you probably treat it like a toy. The lure you tie on when nothing else is working, the one you hand a kid so they catch their first fish off the dock. That toy has a buried history, and it is the first thing the industry would rather you not dwell on. The modern inline spinner was perfected in 1938 by a French engineer named André Molnart, who called it the Aglia. It worked so well that American GIs smuggled it home from Europe after the war, and a Wisconsin shop owner named Todd Sheldon got his first ones from a French woman who mailed them over in trade for nylon stockings. A lure swapped for stockings quietly outfished everything else on his shelves. That is not advertising. That is what happens when a design actually works. So why does it work? Because of an organ the fish has, and you do not. Bass, walleye, pike, big trout, they all carry a chain of tiny motion detectors running down each side of the body called the lateral line, and it reads, moving water the way your skin reads a breeze. In stained water, at night, in a river churned up after a storm, a predator is not hunting with its eyes. It is feeling the water, and a spinning blade speaks straight into that sense. Here is the half almost nobody explains. A spinner does not imitate a healthy minnow. It imitates a hurt one. In a flow tank, where you pump colored dye into the water and film it, a fish swimming normally leaves a clean, paired trail of swirls behind its tail. Physicists call that a vortex street, after the engineer Theodore von Karman. A wounded-baitfish leaves a ragged, stalling version of that trail. A correctly worked spinner forges that exact ragged signature out of stamped metal. To the lateral line, it reads as a cripple, a meal that cannot get away. So why aren't you catching anything on it? Because this lure punishes laziness. Every other bait forgives you a little. The spinner forgives nothing. Wrong speed, wrong depth, wrong blade, wrong line, and you turn a precision instrument into dead weight that fish actively dodge. Let me walk you through the 12 ways anglers wreck it, and the buried science under each one. Most of them you can test on your very next cast. And the first one is the mistake almost everyone makes the instant the lure hits the water. The first mistake happens before the lure is even halfway back to you. You reel too fast. It feels right. The blade flashes harder. The rod hums. You can feel the thing working. So your gut says, faster means more attraction. The water says the opposite. Think about what a spinner is pretending to be. A dying baitfish. A dying baitfish does not rocket across the lake like a torpedo. It limps. It wobbles. It falls behind. When you burn a spinner in too fast, something specific happens, and you can watch it on film over and over. Past a certain speed, the blade can no longer rotate cleanly around the wire. The drag overwhelms it. The whole lure starts barrel rolling as one chaotic unit, and that beautiful crippled baitfish trail collapses into high-frequency noise. To a predator keyed in on the slow, limping signal of easy prey, that noise does not say food. It says wrong. They turn and leave. And there is a measurable reason this happens. The lateral line is built to read low-frequency water motion, the slow, heavy disturbances, not the fast ones. A blade just barely turning lives right inside that band, the same band a struggling baitfish broadcasts on. Burn it in too fast and you climb straight out of the range the fish is actually listening on. You can be reeling your heart out and be, to the predator, effectively silent. So here is the thing the industry will never print on the package. Because slow does not photograph well in a commercial, your retrieve should be almost embarrassingly slow. As slow as you can go while still feeling a light, steady pulse tick through the rod tip. Not a heavy hum, a faint heartbeat. That is the blade just barely turning. That is the speed that turns a fish around. Which brings me to the second mistake, and it is the cousin of the first. You fish it like a jig. You twitch it, pop it, speed up, slow down, snap the rod. That erratic dance is gold on a jerkbait. On a spinner, it is a death sentence, and the reason is pure predator math. A bass or a pike is an ambush calculator. It does not run prey down, it waits, picks an interception point, and fires one short, precise strike. To do that, it needs a target moving on a predictable line. Every time you jerk the rod, the blade stalls and slaps flat against the shaft. The trail breaks, the signal stutters, and an ambush predator will not spend a single calorie lunging at something whose path it cannot solve. Your retrieve has to run like a metronome, smooth, level, almost boring, identical from the first crank to the last. Boring catches fish. Flashy spooks them. But even a flawless retrieve fails if you are running the lure through empty water, and most anglers are fishing the wrong layer of the lake entirely. Mistake 3. You are fishing the wrong depth, and you do not even know it. Watch most anglers and you will see the same thing. Cast, close the bail, and immediately start reeling, which drags the spinner straight through the middle of the water column, 4 or 5 feet down, like a little airplane cruising over the lake. The problem is that your predators are not in the middle. They are pinned to the bottom, tucked against cover, looking up. A bass holding tight to a sunken log is not going to climb 6 feet through open water to chase a blade. It strikes what passes through its window, and your lure is flying right over that window. The fix is patience most people will not give. After the cast, do nothing. Let it sink. Count it down. A rough rule is about 1 foot per second, until you feel it tick the bottom. Then begin your slow retrieve so the blade runs just over the rocks, occasionally bumping them. That bottom foot of water is where the big ones live. Everything above it is a commercial break. Mistake 4 is the one that separates people who catch fish from people who merely own tackle. You use the same blade everywhere, and blade shape is not decoration, it is the entire physics of the lure. There are 2 shapes that matter, and they are opposites. A round, deeply cupped blade, the Colorado style, rides far out from the shaft, plowing a huge amount of water. By most accounts, it kicks out at roughly a 45-degree angle, and it throws a deep, low, heavy thump that a fish can feel from well outside its sight range. That is your muddy water, low light, cold water blade, the one that calls fish in by pure vibration when they cannot see a thing. Now take a long, narrow blade, the willow leaf, which runs tight to the shaft, somewhere near a 20-degree angle. It barely thumps. What it does is flash, spinning fast and clean, throwing light like a fleeing shad. That is your clear water, bright day, fast current blade. There is a 3rd shape worth knowing, the Indiana, a teardrop that splits the difference at around 30 degrees, giving you some thump and some flash when you cannot decide what the water wants. It is the hedge. But the 2 extremes are where the real decisions get made. Get this backwards and you fail twice. Run a wide Colorado into a fast river, and the current blows it up to the surface, spinning uselessly. Run a willow into muddy slack water, and the fish never feel it coming. Match the blade to the water. Vibration for dirty, flash for clear. Or go home empty-handed and blame the lure. And once the shape is right, there is a second matching problem the industry quietly profits from you getting wrong: size. Mistake 5. Your blade is the wrong size for the season. And wrong size is not really about big fish versus small fish. It is about what the fish are actually eating right now. Tie on a big, heavy, hard-thumping spinner in frigid early spring water, and you do the opposite of what you intend. The fish are sluggish, their metabolism crawling, and a loud, fast, oversized object screaming through their zone does not read as food, it reads as a threat, and they slide away from it. Flip it around. Throw a tiny microspinner in the fall when bass and pike are gorging on full-grown shad before winter, and your lure simply vanishes into a buffet of bigger, more convincing prey. The honest rule has almost nothing to do with the fish, and everything to do with the forage. Match the blade to the size of the baitfish in that water at that time of year. Smaller in the cold, when this year's fry are barely an inch long. Bigger in the fall, when the bait has grown fat and the predators want a real mouthful. Mistake 6 is where the industry makes its money off your impatience. You buy cheap, unbalanced junk. We all grab the bargain 3-pack at some point. The problem is that a spinner is a precision machine pretending to be a simple one, and the whole thing lives or dies on one tiny part nobody ever mentions: the clevis, the little metal sleeve the blade pivots on. On a cheap lure, the wire shaft is slightly bent, and the clevis binds with friction. The result? The blade refuses to start turning until you reel it fast. We are talking about a few thousandths of an inch of bend in that wire, invisible in the package, fatal in the water. And you already know what fast does. It destroys the presentation. So the bargain lure quietly forces you into the exact mistake that kills your odds. Here is the test, and you can run it at your feet in 2 seconds. Drop the lure in the water and pull it slowly toward you. If the blade does not snap to life almost instantly, throw it in the trash. It will never fish the way it should. Stick to makers that hold their tolerances, names like Mepps, Blue Fox, and Panther Martin. And one more buried detail. A treble hook dressed with hair or feathers is not just for looks. That dressing acts like a small keel, adding drag that lets the blade spin clean at a crawl without the body rolling over. The dressed hook is a slow retrieve cheat code, and most people walk right past it for the bare one. But the deadliest spinner ever built is worthless if you are standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. So let's talk about where the fish really are and when. Mistake 7. You are fishing where there are no fish. It sounds insulting. It is also the single most common thing I see anglers do. Picture the typical trip. You walk up to an open bank, you wind up, and you launch that spinner as far as you can into the big empty middle of the lake, because casting far feels like effort, and effort feels like fishing. Meanwhile, the predator is sitting a rod's length off the bank, under an overhanging branch, in a foot of water, watching the shallows. Predators are structure animals. They demand an ambush point, a sunken log, a weed edge, a dock piling, a seam where 2 currents meet. They hold against that cover, and they attack out of it. The richest hunting ground in the whole lake is that thin ribbon along the shoreline, and you are casting clean over it to reach water that holds nothing, so turn sideways. Cast parallel to the bank and walk that blade right down the grass line and the laydowns. And do not flinch at shallow water. A giant pike or a heavy bass will sit in 12 inches of water all morning if there is cover and bait nearby. Fish the edges. The middle is a desert with a few fish swimming across it. Mistake 8 is about timing, and it explains more blank trips than any lure ever will. You ignore the predator's clock. You cannot expect a spinner to perform at high noon in summer, when the sun is hammering down and the fish have slid into deep shade with their jaws practically locked shut. That is not the lure failing. That is you fishing at the worst possible hour. The spinner peaks in the low-light windows, the first hour of light, the last hour before dark, and gray, overcast days when the fish roam shallow and feed with confidence. And here is the edge almost nobody uses. Fish a spinner during and right after rain. The reason it works is the lateral line again. Rain hammers the surface and masks the faint sounds and sights of natural prey, but it does almost nothing to the low, heavy thump of a spinning blade pushing water. While every other signal in the lake is buried under static, your blade is still broadcasting clear and strong, straight into the predator's sixth sense. A rainy bank that empties out of other anglers is a gift. If you want proof of how powerful this hidden channel is, look at what a catfish does in total darkness. It does not swim straight at its prey. It cannot see it. It finds the invisible trail of churned water the baitfish left behind, and it follows that wake, looping and weaving along the exact path the prey took, until it runs the meal down by feel alone. The fish are hunting a signature in the water that you cannot even perceive, and every turn of your blade pours a fresh, screaming loud version of that signature into the lake. Now, suppose you have the speed, the depth, the blade, the spot, and the timing all dialed. There is still one whole system that quietly sabotages more anglers than all of that combined, and it lives in the few feet between your reel and your blade. This is the part the industry truly does not want simplified, because confusion here sells swivels, leaders, and line by the spool. 3 mistakes, 1 system. Everything between your hands and the blade. Mistake 9. You tie your main line straight to the spinner. Never do this. A spinner is, by design, a spinning thing under constant rotational force, and tying directly to it pumps that spin straight up your line. You get line twist, corkscrewed braid, wind knots, sudden snap-offs at half your line's rated strength, and a lure that starts tracking crooked. But do not overcorrect by clipping a big, bulky snap swivel right at the lure either. That wrecks the very presentation the fish came for. The fix is small and nearly invisible. Tie a tiny barrel swivel, better still, a ball-bearing swivel, into your main line, then run 12 to 18 inches of clear fluorocarbon leader from the swivel down to the lure. The swivel absorbs the rotation before it ever reaches your line, and the fish never sees the hardware. Mistake 10. You fish bare line in toothy water. If pike, muskie, or a big toothy walleye live where you are casting, running a spinner on plain mono or braid is heartbreak on a timer. One strike and those teeth shear your line like scissors, and now a fish is swimming off with your lure stuck in its jaw. People skip the leader because they swear it spooks fish. Hear me. A pike is locked onto the thump and the silhouette of that blade. It is not putting on reading glasses to inspect your knot. Run a thin, 6 to 8 inch leader of steel, titanium, or heavy fluorocarbon. It saves your lure, it lands the trophy, and it is the humane thing to do for the fish. Mistake 11. You use the wrong line chemistry. Fishing a spinner on cheap, stretchy monofilament is a quiet handicap. Mono behaves like a rubber band, and that built-in stretch soaks up and smears the fine vibration coming off the blade. So you end up fishing blind, with no real idea what the lure is doing down there. Switch your main line to thin, low-stretch braid, somewhere around 10 to 15 pound test. Braid has almost no give. It turns your rod into an antenna. You will feel every heartbeat of the blade, every rock it ticks, and the precise instant a strand of weed fouls the rotation and shuts it down. Feeling that foul and clearing it is the whole difference between fishing and just dragging metal around the lake, which leaves the single most expensive mistake of all, the one that loses the fish after it has already decided to eat. Mistake 12. You set the hook like you are swinging an axe. You feel a tap, your arms move before your brain catches up. You rip the rod back with everything you have, and you pull the lure clean out of the fish's mouth. Gone. Here is what is actually happening down there and why the violent hook set fails specifically on a spinner. A spinner is a moving chunk of metal, and fish do not always eat it cleanly on the first pass. A bass will often swat the blade, miss, then wheel around and inhale it from behind. A pike will frequently hit it sideways and only then turn to swallow. If you swing on that first tap, the bump, the flash of contact, you are setting into nothing, or worse, snatching the lure away mid-decision. So do the counterintuitive thing. When you feel the hit, pause, just for a beat. Keep the reel turning smooth, let the rod load up with the real weight of the fish, and then sweep. A firm, smooth, sideways pull into the corner of the jaw. No violence, no axe. A loaded rod and a smooth sweep will land 10 fish for every one you tear away. So here is what the tackle industry buried under all that plastic and all those electronics. The thing that triggers the strike was never the paint job, never the three-dimensional scan, never the price on the tag. It was the flow. The low, heavy thump, the crippled baitfish trail, the signal cutting straight into a sense the fish cannot switch off. Researchers like Horst Bleckmann and James Liao have spent entire careers showing how fish read these water trails, how a predator can track prey by feel alone in total darkness. Wolf Hanke and his colleagues even filmed live fish with particle imaging cameras, mapping frame by frame the exact swirling trail a tail leaves behind, measuring in a lab the very thing your cheap blade is faking. None of that work is secret. It is sitting in the journals. The industry simply has no reason to teach it to you, because a $4 piece of bent wire that you only have to buy once is a terrible business model. So master the speed, respect the lateral line, match the blade to the water, and the size to the season. Kill the line twist, feel the blade through braid, and sweep instead of swing. Do that, and you will quietly outfish the angler next to you launching his entire paycheck into the lake. If this changed the way you see that little blade rusting at the bottom of your box, subscribe and stay with us. We dig up the field-tested truths the tackle industry would rather keep buried. Drop a comment and tell me the first fish you ever landed on a spinner. Keep those blades turning, read the water, and I will see you on the next one.